The subject today is truth, truthiness, capital T, truth, however you want to frame it. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm very proud to be the moderator of this panel of very distinguished journalists and some really great superstars of investigative reporting. From your right, or your left, my right, David Barstow. David was a finalist for 3 Pulitzer Prizes for investigative reporting at the St. Pete Times. He then won a piece of a Pulitzer in 2004, and in 2009 won one all by himself. And he has made a specialty of what I have come to call truthiness, or the idea of the way truth is hedged in various and sundry ways. That's certainly not the only thing he's done, but he did a brilliant piece that many of you saw, I'm sure, about the way military senior officers were being put on television to talk not about something they ostensibly didn't know about, but about something that they had a great self-interest in and did not reveal, and that their views and opinions were shaped by the Bush administration. It was a terrific piece of work, and it was a very illuminating one about, in a general sense, what we're going to be talking about today. Next to David is Tom Fiedler, who is the dean of the College of Communication at Boston University. He was an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, later became editor of the Miami Herald. He has started at BU the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. Next to him is Blake Morrison, a long-time and very highly regarded investigative reporter for USA Today, and now, as of a year ago, head of the investigative projects work at Reuters, the head of the investigative projects editor. And finally, Melissa Ludtke. Melissa is a very distinguished reporter in her own right. She was for many years the editor of Neiman Reports, which examined in a kind of philosophical way the elements of journalism in all their forms and as they have evolved over the years. She is now executive editor of the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis. So thank you, panelists. Let me give you my sort of the fundamental overview premise of this, and we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to include you in to that conversation. It's going to be a conversation not about how this group of people or you feel about factual accuracy. I'm going to sort of take it as an article of faith, and maybe I'm wrong, and please correct me if I am, that this is something that you need no persuading about. But I do believe that something is changing. I think something important is changing, and I think that it's something that I would hope that we are going to try to understand from the perspective of the people who are doing it, and from the perspective of the broad audience that is consuming it. Because how they feel about what they do, and how those consumers feel about what is being done by these people, is going to affect, I believe, how your work is received, and how your work is respected, and how your work is able to do the thing that investigative reporting is so powerful at doing, which is to alter perceptions of reality and change minds based on a belief that you're finding out something that you didn't know was true and that you were being told is true and is, in fact, true. That's lowercase true, not uppercase true. Now, what is different, it seems to me, is this. We've always had people who cheated. We've always had, Jason Blairs and Janet Cooks, Stephen Glasses, who simply were too lazy or too ambitious or for whatever reason made up facts and cooked the books as far as their work is concerned. We've also had, we have a long tradition of hedging truth. That's what public relations is all about. Public relations is on a continuum, that goes between, PR, which is making a case that is based on accurate facts, but doesn't necessarily include all those facts. And it's not sort of in the tradition of journalism that is intended to tell you the best truth that you can get. PR, as I understand it and think of it, is not dishonest. It's honest like a lawyer is honest. It's advocacy in a kind of way that allows the people who are using it to make a case based on facts that are verifiable but may not tell the full story. What's new is that we now have a group of people doing something that presents itself as factual journalism and is frankly not. It's not something that they're too lazy to do. It's something that philosophically they have decided doesn't matter. It is something that they basically have determined that in the service of capital T truth or art, they are not bound to do. Or they are doing what they do and altering the facts and making up facts and unverifying and putting in unsubstantiated facts in service of a larger purpose, an advocacy purpose, a capital T truth purpose, if you will. I want to start this morning with trying to get inside the heads of the people who are the cheaters, because I think there is a kind of slippery slope here and a kinship. We have with Blake a person who was very close proximity to one of the great and legendary cheaters, Jack Kelly. Jack Kelly, you may remember, was a sort of a marquee investigative reporter for USA Today. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2002 for his work about covering things like terrorism. He had a very dramatic story, you may recall, about a bomb going off in Jerusalem and heads flying and so forth, and it was all lies. And USA Today basically turned to Blake to find out the truth. Blake, would you tell us your story?
Sure. There were 5 of us reporters and an editor who were taking a look at all the stories that Jack had written at USA Today in 20 years, which were 1,400 stories. And what we were tasked with was essentially figuring out which ones were fact and which ones were fiction, if any. And we quickly were able to come to the conclusion after reading some of them that there were going to be some serious issues we needed to look at. And one thing that occurred to me after reading a few dozen of his biggest stories was that Jack always seemed to be around when somebody was breathing their last breath. And so we started keeping track of how many times Jack was there to witness someone's last breath. In a dozen years doing foreign reporting, which is pretty much when we think this started in 1991, he witnessed somebody's dying words 13 times, which made him the Grim Reaper of reporters. And at that point, you started understanding a little bit about what we might have been up against. You know, Alex just mentioned the story for which Jack was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and he was at a pizzeria bombing in Jerusalem. And the story he told was that he went inside the Sbarro pizzeria with a friend of his. He bumped into a Palestinian man who looked nervous. It was so crowded that they left. And 90 feet away, Jack was thrown to his knees by the force of a blast. He got up, turned around, and saw 3 men flying out of the Sbarro pizzeria, and when they hit the ground, their heads came off and rolled to the curb. Jack ran back into the pizzeria, and there on the floor was the head of the Palestinian man, who it turned out was the suicide bomber. And he wrote an incredible, and it was, first-person account of that story for USA Today, and then he went on NBC, and recounted exactly what happened. And he went on reliable sources and recounted exactly what happened. And nobody stopped to ask how many men really were decapitated at the Sbarro pizzeria bombing, because Jack certainly saw 3, not counting the suicide bomber. The answer turned out to be none. And the person that Jack ran into, the suicide bomber, his head was never on the floor. It turned out that he blew himself in half, and the upper part of his body was lodged in a bed above the ovens. So Jack was there. We put him there. We found him there. We had people who were there within 2 minutes who verified that he was there. But for whatever reason, he decided to take the story to a different level, to embellish it, to change things. And ultimately, what I think compelled Jack was the idea that the more powerful you can make a story, the better it will be, that truth has a capital T in it, and that the facts can be twisted a bit to support. There was a suicide bombing, we know that. They were, it was awful, people died, we know that. But when you think about heads rolling to a curb, and when you think about, how close Jack came to death and seeing the face of the suicide bomber on the ground, it makes that story all the more powerful. So, you can look at it and say, well, how come people at USA Today didn't catch that story? Certainly a question that a lot of us asked ourselves after that. But keep in mind, as again, he was on NBC. He was on reliable sources with Howard Kurtz. The Pulitzer jury forwarded it as a finalist. There were many people who read that same story, and no one, until we started looking at it, decided to check those facts.
I can assume that Jack was sorry he got caught. Do you think he was sorry for what he did?
I'm not sure if Jack really understands what he did. You know, part of the dynamic with Jack is that he is a born-again Christian, and he wore that on his sleeve. And I think that at some point, and this is just my theory, that part of what he was able to do was reconcile what he was doing as somehow providing a greater good. That is, that because he was writing more powerful stories, it was conveying a stronger, more meaningful message. And even though they were generally true, and by generally true I mean when he wrote about Cuban refugees leaving Cuba, all the particulars of his story were made up, but we all know that there are refugees who leave Cuba. So Jack just decided, I can tell a very powerful story if I make up the facts around that, because we all know that's generally true. So he would wrap specific facts, specific, you know, made up things around believable things. So you bought into the story, and you know, if you didn't really go any deeper, you believe it. And again, that was another story that we looked at with Cuban refugees, where Reader's Digest repurchased the story and ran it through its fact-checking desk and found no problems.
David, you have, as I say, you have spent some time on how people in official positions or in the service of a policy have shaved truth in order to persuade, to make something powerful. Take us inside as best you can the heads of those senior officers that you wrote about. And the heads of the news organizations.
I think that's actually the more interesting thing.
Well, there you are. Yes.
Yeah.
It's the heads of the news editors, because I think in terms of what the military officials and the former generals were thinking is fairly straightforward, and that is, on the one hand, they were all kind of hardwired to be supportive of the Pentagon and the administration to begin with, but then layered on top of that, of course, is that most of them, their day jobs were in fact to win contracts associated with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so it was a really obvious win-win-win for them to be seen on TV parroting talking points and things that had been spoon-fed to them from the Pentagon. That would just give them even more access, and that access would give them an even bigger leg up when it came time to get the next contract. To me, the really interesting part of that was the networks and the way that they kind of rationalized a system that would put these guys on air constantly. And I think part of it was, I think I connect this story to something that I think is a larger shift that's been occurring, which is we've seen, obviously, all of us here have seen this erosion of journalistic muscle in this country over the last 15 years or so. And we've witnessed this cutting back of reporters and budgets and so forth. And at the same time, we have seen the rise, at the same time, of the muscle of spin, the muscle of PR, the muscle of strategic communication. And that muscle is what many of these retired generals actually represent. They are, in many cases, they were affiliated with these quasi-lobbying strategic communications groups that have sprung up in Washington, D.C. And I think certainly the Bush administration, as they were looking at the media landscape in the aftermath of 9/11, as they were looking at the way this war was going to play out on television, they could smell the weakness inside the networks, that the networks were not going to be able to afford to keep people on the ground in the levels that they kept people on the ground for the first couple of months during the Iraq invasion. That they knew that as time went on, you know, correspondents were going to be pulled back home, and yet this war was going to continue, and every time something happened in Abu Ghraib or a Haditha, some kind of major event, the networks were going to need a panel, experts, someone to come on and talk right away, and they understood there was a vulnerability there. And I know that Tory Clark, who was the kind of the brains behind this, had a clear sense that the way the American public has evolved over the years, it's become so deeply cynical, both of the journalists, but also of government spokespeople. And so they, in their mind, the most effective way to move public opinion was to try to get these guys that they called third-party authority figures, who would be seen as independent of the media, but also independent of the government, to carry the talking points of the Pentagon to the American public. And there's no better third-party authority figure in the American culture than a retired four-star general.
Well, now, these news organizations and these news editors that you were referring to all worked for organizations that had standards. They claimed standards anyway. Did they think that they were doing something wrong, even after your stories appeared?
I think they knew in their heart of hearts that they had done something wrong.
But it took heart of hearts kind of.
But it was for the most part, these people have disappeared from the air since the story. But I do think that there was an incredible. I mean, you know, I remember a conversation with one network executive, and I was like, you know, could you imagine the size of the scandal it would be if it turned out that front page stories were being written at the New York Times by somebody who was actually over there in Iraq trying to get contracts at the same time they were reporting a story. That would be a huge scandal. Why aren't you upset that you're putting on air as these sort of independent and authoritative and, you know, with no vested interest? Why are you putting these people on air when you know that when they're over there, they're looking for contracts? And they just kind of justified it like, well, they're not our reporters. They're, you know, they're pundit. They're, you know, and they constructed this sort of logic that somehow it was a pretzel logic, but it was a logic that said, you know, they just the same rules don't apply. In one case, it was sort of like, well, I mean, one of the guys who I really focused on was this General Barry McCaffrey, who's on NBC an awful lot, and who spends, you know, his entire existence revolves around trying to get contracts for major companies like DynCorp and others in Afghanistan and Iraq, and yet not once in all of the times that he was appearing on Meet the Press and on other major big-time NBC news programs was any of that ever disclosed to the public. And so the biggest puzzle in my mind about this, and it's something I still can't quite answer, is, okay, I understand you want to bring military expertise to the table. That makes sense. But there are, you know, tons of people out there who have military expertise who aren't at the same time trying to get contracts.
I mean, the thing is, it's obvious, except it wasn't what happened. Tom, you teach young people to be journalists now, and you teach them in a digital age. And I think we would all agree that the values of the web are, you know, ones in journalistic terms that are now putting speed ahead of accuracy, or at least rigorous accuracy, that put voice ahead of fairness, and that prize entertainment values very, very highly, maybe more highly than anything else. And another thing that the web does, it seems to me, increasingly, is just mush everything together. A mashup is very much a web concept. And when you mash up fiction and nonfiction, when you mash up essay and reporting, you get situations like and hypothetically take license that they might feel that they could take a memoir or an essay and put it into a form that presents itself as what most people would simply accept or believe is nonfiction, meaning that the facts are accurate. When you think about how the web culture is affecting this issue of standards of truthfulness and accuracy, do you see a problem?
All of what you said, yes, is a part of it. There's another piece of it too, though, that the web has done, which may be even more insidious, and the web has brought a profusion of other voices to this whole question about establishing truth or establishing truthiness. I mean, it used to be that, certainly when I started and going back for, I don't know what, many decades, that we really looked to what we think of now as the mainstream media as establishing what would be settled as the truth, the capital T truth and the small t truth, so when it was reported in the New York Times or the Washington Post or other respected news organizations, we tended to believe it because we felt these people have a stake in the truth, they're guardians of the truth, and when you have a Janet Cook or a Jason Blair or a Jack Kelly, when one of our own is a transgressor, well, you pull that person out, and in many cases you have a public reckoning there, and that person goes off. It's like the old days, you rip off their shoulder boards and drum them out. They violated this compact that both the old news organizations had, and we depended on that because that was virtually the only way that we had truth. But what's happened, I think, to your question, Alex, is that with the web now, not only are things more easily mashed together for the people who are producing the content, but I think what we have now is a real battle over who gets to decide what truth is. Who establishes the truth? And you used the expression, David, about the erosion of journalistic muscle. And as journalistic muscle has receded, withered a bit, these other voices who want to be seen as the truth tellers, they emerge. That's why I think you have something like the so-called experts that go out there. And you have what amounts to, and for a consumer of information, a battle over who actually is going to be the person who tells the truth. Where do I go? How do I decide? And an example of this, it's sort of the inverse of what we're talking about, is, and I saw Walter Robinson was here. He did a lot of work on this. The Dan Rather case, Rathergate, as it came to be known. And Dan Rather, just those of you who hadn't followed the details, in the run-up to the 2004 presidential election, CBS, Dan Rather, and his top investigative producer, Mary Mapes, had come up with what they thought was going to be the smoking gun document that would explain that George W. Bush had, it was the so-called missing year in Bush's resume, where he was supposed to be in the Air National Guard and he never showed up for his exercises in Alabama. And there was a big question, did he actually go AWOL? Was there something wrong there? And so Dan Rather came up with and went on the air in his 60 Minutes show with what he said were the smoking gun documents that would say that that Rather, in fact, it was known to his superiors that he essentially skipped out at that time. Well, it was literally hours, maybe even minutes before the blogosphere, the conservative blogosphere, began attacking the report on CBS, claiming that the document that they were showing was a cheap forgery, and this created a long investigation by CBS, and the details of which turned out to be ambiguous, and but now we're, 5 or 6 years away from this, and it's increasingly murky about whether those were actually forgeries. They were certainly lousy copies. There were some questions about that. But I think what's important, and you look back on this, and it really destroyed Dan Rather's career, is who ultimately emerged as the person with truthiness on their side, and it was the blogosphere. The blogosphere won that battle in a sense that they discredited CBS and discredited the report. And we may never really know whether George W. Bush kind of skipped out on his obligations. So I just bring that up in that, when we think about what has happened in the new environment, what we need to remember is there's a whole different player today in this, and that player are those people who have their own way of getting to the consumers of news and making it more difficult today for those consumers to really know what truth is. And I think it's really a serious